December 1980. In a quiet hospital room in Louisville, the legendary white suit of Colonel Sanders hangs alone in a closet. The goatee has grown thin. The hands that once perfected the most famous fried chicken recipe in the world rest quietly at his sides. Outside, the world prepares for Christmas. Inside room 412, there is only silence and the steady beep of machines. His wife Claudia sits beside him, holding the same hand that signed franchise agreements across America, the same hand that pulled their family out of poverty and into legend. But his true heart was never here. It lay 60 miles southeast in a quiet Kentucky town called Shelbyville, inside a mansion called Blackwood Hall. The world knew Colonel Sanders as the smiling face on a bucket, the white suit, the string tie, the folksy charm that built a global empire. But Blackwood Hall held something different, something most people never saw. It was not just a house, it was a fortress, a place where Sanders tried to freeze time itself, to control an empire slipping from his grasp. Behind those Greek Revival columns and carefully manicured lawns lay the machinery of obsession, a spice blending operation, a training kitchen, walls lined with contracts and complaints. And Claudia, always Claudia, the woman who spent 15 hours a day maintaining standards the world would never fully see. When Sanders passed that cold December morning, flags across Kentucky dropped to half-staff. The governor ordered his body to lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda, an honor reserved for politicians and war heroes. But the true monument was not in Frankfurt. It was in Shelbyville, in every carved ebony panel, in every perfectly measured spice blend, in every staircase riser custom-built, because his wife's arthritis made climbing painful. This is the story of Blackwood Hall, the dreams it held, the empire it built, the price it demanded, and the truth behind the white suit. But to understand why a man would build such a fortress, we must first understand the boy who learned what happens when everything you love can be taken away in an instant. September 9th, 1890, Henryville, Indiana. Harlan David Sanders was born in a small 4-room farmhouse. His father, Wilbur Sanders, worked an 80-acre farm. Life was simple but unforgiving. The soil was hard. The winters brutal. Money always tight. Then, when Harlan was just 5 years old, tragedy struck. His father fell ill and died, leaving his mother Margaret alone with 3 young children and almost nothing to her name. The weight of survival fell on shoulders far too small. Margaret took work at a tomato canning factory. She sewed clothes for neighboring families. Often, she disappeared for days at a time, and in her absence, young Harlan became the caretaker. He cleaned. He watched over his younger brother and sister. And, most importantly, he cooked. By the age of 7, Harlan Sanders could prepare a full meal from scratch. He learned to stretch ingredients, to make something from almost nothing, to feed hungry mouths with whatever the pantry offered. It was not a gift. It was survival. The kitchen became his classroom. Necessity became his greatest teacher. And somewhere in that small Indiana farmhouse, a pattern was forming. When the world takes everything, you learn to hold tight to what remains. You learn that the only safety is in control. The only stability is what you build with your own hands. The fortress was already forming. It would just take 60 years to build. But before Sanders could build anything permanent, he would first have to wander through 3 decades of failure. 3 decades that would teach him the world offers no guarantees. And that success, when it finally comes, can vanish just as quickly. When Harlan turned 10, he took his first job working on a nearby farm, $4 a month plus room and board. School became an afterthought. By the time he was 12, his mother remarried, bringing the children to live with a stepfather in Indianapolis. But the relationship was poisonous from the start. Harlan and his stepfather clashed constantly. their arguments growing louder and more violent with each passing month. Finally, at 13, Harland was sent away to live and work on a farm in Clark County. His formal education ended in the 7th grade. He would never return to school again. What followed was a wandering life that seemed to have no direction. Over the next 30 years, Harland Sanders held more jobs than most people could count. He worked as a farmhand, feeding livestock before dawn and collapsing into sleep after dark. He became a streetcar conductor in Indianapolis, collecting fares and learning the rhythm of the city. At 16, he lied about his age and enlisted in the United States Army, serving briefly in Cuba before receiving an honorable discharge. After the Army, he worked as a railroad fireman, shoveling coal into steam engines that roared across the American heartland. He tried his hand at being a blacksmith, a tire salesman, a ferry boat operator, and an insurance agent. He even studied law through a correspondence course and practiced briefly in Arkansas, only to destroy his legal career in a courtroom brawl with his own client. Failure followed him like a shadow. Jobs came and went. Money slipped through his fingers. His first marriage to Josephine King in 1908 produced 3 children, but crumbled under the weight of constant relocations and financial stress. Then came the loss that nearly broke him. His son, Harland Jr., died at just 20 years old from blood poisoning following a routine tonsillectomy. The grief was unbearable. A father watching his own son die from something that should have been simple. By his mid-40s, Harland Sanders had experienced enough tragedy and disappointment to fill several lifetimes. Every failure taught him the same lesson. Nothing lasts unless you control it yourself. No job is safe. No place is permanent. The world takes what it wants, when it wants. The only answer was to build something that could not be taken away. A fortress, a system, a standard so perfect that no corporation, no highway, no act of God could destroy it. But first, he would need to find success, just once. And when he did, the world would try to take that too. That success would come in an unlikely place, a small gas station in Corbin, Kentucky, where a 40-year-old man with nothing left to lose would finally discover what he was meant to build. 1930. Corbin, Kentucky. At the age of 40, Harland Sanders arrived in a town where the Great Depression was tightening its grip. Factories were closing, banks were failing, families were losing their homes. But Harland saw something different in Corbin. He saw opportunity. He took over a Shell service station along U.S. Route 25, the main north-south highway running through the Appalachian region. Travelers passed through constantly, their automobiles thirsty for fuel and their stomachs growling for food. Most gas stations offered neither comfort nor hospitality. Harland decided to change that. In the back room of the service station, he set up his own dining table, seating just 6 customers at a time. He cooked the meals himself. Steaks, country ham, and, of course, fried chicken. The recipes were his own, honed over decades of cooking for his family and anyone else who would eat. Word spread quickly. Locals began stopping by, not for gasoline, but for food. Travelers detoured from their routes just to taste what this strange, energetic man was serving in his tiny dining room. By 1937, his reputation had grown so large that he built a proper restaurant across the street, the Sanders Cafe, seating for 142 guests. A motel soon followed, offering weary travelers a place to rest after their meal. Business boomed. The Sanders Cafe became a landmark along Route 25, drawing customers from across the state. Finally, something he controlled completely. Something the world could not take away. Or so he thought. Then came the recognition that would change everything. In 1935, Kentucky Governor Ruby LaFoon bestowed upon Harland Sanders the honorary title of Kentucky Colonel, recognizing his contributions to the state's cuisine. It was a largely ceremonial honor given to outstanding citizens. But Sanders embraced it fully. He began calling himself Colonel Sanders, adopting a new persona that would eventually become one of the most recognizable images in the world. He grew a goatee. He traded his work clothes for a white suit. He added a black string tie. The transformation was complete. The white suit was not authenticity. It was armor. A carefully constructed image that said, "I have arrived. I am permanent. I am in control." By 1939, the restaurant was doing so well that the legendary food critic Duncan Hines, yes, the same Duncan Hines, whose name now graces cake mixes across America, visited and included the Sanders Cafe in his influential guidebook, Adventures in Good Eating. The review brought even more customers. The Colonel's fame spread beyond Kentucky's borders. Everything seemed perfect. Harlan Sanders, after decades of failure and wandering, had finally found success. He had a thriving business, a growing reputation, a future that looked brighter than ever. He had built something solid, something stable, something that felt like it could last forever. But fate was not finished with him yet. The world was about to remind him, one more time, that nothing is permanent, that progress destroys as easily as it builds, that even success can vanish overnight. And when it did, the lesson would be carved so deep that it would shape everything he built afterward. In the early 1950s, the United States government announced plans for a new interstate highway system. For most Americans, it represented progress, convenience, the promise of a more connected country. For Harlan Sanders, it represented disaster. The planned route for Interstate 75 would bypass Corbin entirely. The same highway that had brought thousands of hungry travelers past his front door would now carry them miles away, never even knowing his restaurant existed. The lifeblood of his business, the steady stream of customers who stopped for gas and stayed for chicken, would simply vanish. Sanders watched helplessly as construction crews began their work in the mid-1950s. He knew what was coming. He could see the future written in every mile of fresh asphalt. By 1956, the situation had become untenable. Traffic to his restaurant dropped steadily. The motel rooms sat empty. The kitchen that once hummed with activity grew quiet. At 65 years old, the age when most Americans were collecting their first Social Security checks and settling into retirement, Harlan Sanders was forced to sell his business at auction. When the final hammer fell, he barely made enough to cover his debts. After paying off his mortgage and outstanding bills, he was left with almost nothing. His monthly income consisted of a single Social Security check for $15, roughly $125 in today's money. 20 years of work, gone. Not because he had failed, not because his food was bad, not because his service was poor, but because the world decided to build a road somewhere else. It was the final lesson, the one that would shape everything that came after. He would never again build something that depended on forces beyond his control. Never again trust the world to leave his success untouched. Never again believe that stability comes from anything other than absolute, uncompromising control. The fortress was no longer just a thought. It was a necessity. But first, he would have to rebuild from nothing. One more time. Most men would have accepted defeat at 65, but Harlan Sanders packed his car with a pressure cooker, his secret blend of 11 herbs and spices, and his Kentucky Colonel certificate. Then he drove out of Corbin with a dream that most people would have called foolish. Picture an old man in a white suit, driving alone through the back roads of Kentucky in the late 1950s. He has no appointment, no business card, no company behind him, just a recipe in his head and a pressure cooker in his trunk. This was Harlan Sanders at 65, beginning the most unlikely chapter of his life. His plan was simple but audacious. He would visit restaurants across the country, cook his fried chicken for the owners and their staff, and if they liked it, negotiate a franchise deal. In exchange for using his recipe and his name, they would pay him 5 cents for every piece of chicken they sold. It was not a sophisticated business model. There were no lawyers, no contracts, no corporate infrastructure, just a handshake and a promise. But this time, he would control everything. The recipe, the standards, the name, the quality. The first months were brutal. Restaurant owners slammed doors in his face. They laughed at this old man in his ridiculous white suit, this self-proclaimed colonel who wanted a nickel for every chicken leg. Sanders slept in the back of his car, washed up in gas station bathrooms, and ate the cheapest meals he could find. His wife, Claudia, sometimes traveled with him, sharing the cramped quarters and the endless rejections. But he refused to quit. He had spent his entire life failing and getting back up. This was just one more challenge, one more obstacle to overcome. And slowly, impossibly, his persistence began to pay off. The first official Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise opened in 1952 in Salt Lake City, Utah, operated by a man named Pete Harmon. Harmon coined the phrase "finger-lickin' good" and introduced the now famous paper bucket. The restaurant was an immediate success. Words spread to other restaurant owners. Suddenly, people were calling Sanders instead of the other way around. By 1959, Sanders had more than 200 franchises. By 1963, that number had grown to over 600. Kentucky Fried Chicken was becoming a phenomenon, spreading across America and into Canada. The Colonel's face appeared on every bucket, every advertisement, every storefront. He was no longer just a man. He was becoming a legend. But even as his empire grew, Sanders needed something more. He needed a home, a headquarters, a place to run his operation, to train his franchisees, to store and ship his secret spice blend. Most importantly, he needed a place where he could maintain absolute control over the quality that made his chicken different from everyone else's. A place where the world could not build a highway through his dreams. A place that would be his, permanently, untouchably. He found exactly what he was looking for in a small Kentucky town called Shelbyville, in a mansion that had been waiting for him since 1866. Blackwood Hall rose on the outskirts of Shelbyville like a monument from another era. White columns, Greek Revival elegance. 3 acres of Kentucky countryside. For nearly a century it had passed through various owners, but in 1959 it would find its most famous resident, and become something far more than a house. 1866. Shelbyville, Kentucky. Just 1 year after the Civil War ended, a stately mansion rose on the outskirts of town. White columns, Greek Revival elegance. 5,000 square feet spread across 2 stories with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and windows that captured the soft Kentucky light. It was called Blackwood Hall, a name reportedly inspired by a Nancy Drew novel. For nearly a century it passed through various owners, each leaving their mark on its walls. But in 1959, it found its most famous resident. When Harland and Claudia Sanders first saw Blackwood Hall, something clicked. The Corbin chapter was closed. The interstate had destroyed their restaurant, but their franchise business was growing faster than either of them could have imagined. They needed space, not just for living, but for operations. The location was perfect, situated along U.S. Route 60 with easy access to Louisville and the rest of Kentucky. And there was space behind the main house to build the warehouse and office they desperately needed. They purchased the property and moved in immediately. For Claudia, it was a dream come true. After years of uncertainty, after sleeping in the backs of cars and living out of suitcases, she finally had a real home. For Harland, it was something else entirely. It was a fortress. Not the kind with moats and battlements, but the kind built from Greek Revival columns that said permanence, from 3 acres of controlled space, from walls thick enough to contain secrets worth protecting. This was architecture as self-defense. Every choice Sanders made about Blackwood Hall was a response to what the world had taken from him. The highway could not reroute around property you owned. The government could not declare your home obsolete. The columns were not decoration, they were declarations. I am here. I am permanent. I control what happens within these walls. Blackwood Hall became the nerve center of his empire. In the building behind the main house, Claudia mixed and packaged the secret blend of 11 herbs and spices that made Kentucky Fried Chicken famous. She filled orders, answered phones, and shipped supplies to franchises across the country. It was a family operation run out of a Kentucky mansion by an old man in a white suit and his devoted wife. But Sanders was not content to simply run a business from his home. He wanted control, total control, over quality, over training, over every piece of chicken that bore his name. Inside Blackwood Hall, in a kitchen that still contained its original stove, aspiring franchisees traveled from across America to learn the secrets of Kentucky Fried Chicken directly from the Colonel himself. He would stand at that stove, white suit immaculate, string tie perfectly knotted, and demonstrate exactly how his chicken should be prepared. His standards were exacting, his patience was limited, his language, when things went wrong, could make a sailor blush. But those who survived the Colonel's training left with something invaluable. They had learned directly from the master. They had stood in the very kitchen where the dream became reality. Blackwood Hall was his answer to Interstate 75, a place the world could not take away. Or so he thought. By 1964, Kentucky Fried Chicken had grown beyond anything Sanders had imagined. More than 600 franchises operated across the United States and Canada. The business was generating millions of dollars. But it was also consuming him. At 73 years old, the Colonel was exhausted. The constant travel, the endless meetings, the pressure of managing such a massive operation had taken their toll. He no longer had the energy to oversee every detail, to visit every restaurant, to maintain the standards he had spent his life perfecting. Then came an offer. A group of investors led by John Y. Brown Jr. and Jack C. Massey approached Sanders with a proposal. They wanted to buy Kentucky Fried Chicken outright. The price was $2 million, roughly $19 million in today's money. In exchange, Sanders would give up control of the company, but remain as its official spokesperson and quality ambassador, earning a salary of $40,000 per year, about $330,000 in modern terms. It seemed like the perfect solution. Sanders could step back from the exhausting day-to-day operations, while still protecting the quality that mattered most to him. He would have financial security, freedom from administrative burdens, and a guaranteed role ensuring his standards remained intact. In 1964, he signed the papers. The fortress remained his. The spice-blending operation at Blackwood Hall continued. Claudia still mixed and packaged these secret herbs and spices. Franchisees still came to Shelbyville for training. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Within months, Sanders began noticing differences. Small at first, the investors wanted to streamline operations, cut costs, improve profit margins. They changed suppliers to save money, they modified preparation procedures to increase speed, they reduced portion sizes to boost profitability, and the taste began to change. Sanders was furious. This was not about money. This was about the one thing he had spent 65 years trying to control: quality, standards. The promise that every piece of chicken bearing his name would be exactly as he intended. He had survived poverty, failure, and Interstate 75. He had built a fortress. He had created a system. And now, men in suits who had never cooked a piece of chicken in their lives were destroying it for quarterly earnings reports. In 1970, Sanders did something remarkable. He sued the company that bore his name. The lawsuit accused Headline Inc., which had purchased KFC from the original investors, of misusing his image and allowing food quality to deteriorate. In court documents filed in 1973, Sanders used a word that revealed everything about how he felt. He called the new product slop, not adequate or different. Slop, the product of his life's work, reduced to pig feed by corporate optimization. The court case dragged on. Sanders appeared at hearings in his white suit, now armor against his own company. He gave interviews. He criticized the food publicly. He became an adversary to the empire that bore his face on every bucket. The lawsuit was eventually settled, but the damage was done. Not to the corporation, to Sanders. He had learned the final, cruelest lesson. The fortress had failed. Not the building. The contract. You could control the property, you could control the recipe, you could control the training, but you could not control what happened after you signed away the name. Blackwood Hall stood solid, but the empire had slipped through the walls anyway. So Sanders did the only thing left. He opened a restaurant of his own, right there in Shelbyville, just a few miles from Blackwood Hall. He called it the Claudia Sanders Dinner House. No corporation, no investors, no quarterly reports. Just him, Claudia, and the original standards. The way it was supposed to be. The fortress within the fortress. But even as Sanders fought his legal battles and opened his own restaurant, the true engine of his empire continued to operate behind the walls of Blackwood Hall, and it was powered not by the colonel in his white suit, but by the woman who had been there from the beginning, working 15-hour days in a world that would never fully see her. Behind the white columns and Greek Revival elegance of Blackwood Hall, another story was unfolding, one that never appeared in franchise agreements or advertising campaigns. This was the story of the invisible machine. While Sanders traveled in his white suit and the world celebrated his folksy charm, a small team operated in near silence behind the mansion. Their job was to maintain the one thing that made the empire possible: consistency. Every single franchisee across America received their spice blend from Shelbyville. Every bag, every order, every gram, measured to exact specifications. This was not automated. This was not mass production, with conveyor belts and machinery. This was Claudia Sanders and a rotating staff of 3 to 5 workers, standing in a converted warehouse behind Blackwood Hall, measuring spices by hand. The economics of perfection were brutal. In 1965, a warehouse worker at the Shelbyville operation earned approximately $9 per day, roughly $75 in today's money. For a 6-day work week, that came to about $54, or around $450 by modern standards. These workers arrived at 7 in the morning. They left at 6 in the evening. 11-hour days, 6 days a week. But Claudia's days were longer. She worked 15 hours, sometimes more. She oversaw the mixing. She managed inventory. She filled emergency orders when franchisees called in panic because they were running low. She answered the phone. She kept the books. She packaged shipments. And she did this while managing a household, hosting franchisee training sessions, and maintaining the public role of the colonel's gracious wife. There was no salary listed in any public record for Claudia. She was not an employee. She was family, which meant her labor was assumed, expected, invisible. The warehouse itself was modest, approximately 800 square feet, no climate control beyond a basic heating system for winter. In summer, the Kentucky heat made the work nearly unbearable. The spice blending process required precision. Each of the 11 herbs and spices had to be measured in exact ratios. A deviation of even a few grams could alter the taste that millions of customers expected. This was not the work of machines. This was the work of hands that knew the weight of a quarter teaspoon without measuring, eyes that could spot inconsistency in a blend, bodies that stood for 11 hours because there was no time to sit. By 1964, when Sanders sold the company, the Shelbyville operation was processing orders for over 600 franchises. Conservative estimates suggest they were producing and shipping between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds of spice blend per month. That is approximately 100 pounds per day. Mixed, measured, packaged, and shipped by hand. The operational cost of running this warehouse, including wages, materials, shipping, and utilities, likely ran between $1,500 and $2,000 per month in 1964 dollars. That is roughly $13,000 to $17,000 in today's money. Sanders paid these costs personally until the corporate sale. After 1964, the new owners continued the Shelbyville operation because they had no choice. The fortress held the recipe. The fortress held the process. The fortress held Claudia. This was the invisible machine that powered the fortress. When Sanders called the corporate product slop, he was not just talking about taste. He was talking about the destruction of a system built on precision that only human hands could maintain. The corporations wanted automation, efficiency, scale. But perfection does not scale. It requires Claudia, standing in a hot warehouse for 15 hours. It requires workers who know the difference between close enough and exactly right. The white suit was theater. The mansion was symbol. This warehouse was the truth. And when Sanders opened the Claudia Sanders Dinner House in 1968, he named it after the only person who truly understood what perfection cost. Not in dollars, in years, in hours, in hands swollen from mixing, in backs aching from standing. The fortress stood because someone powered it from within. But Claudia's sacrifice was only one part of the story. The mansion itself held secrets that revealed how deeply Sanders understood the toll his standards took. In the walls, in the staircases, in details most visitors never noticed, the Colonel had built accommodations for the invisible cost of his empire. Her name was Claudia Ellen Leddington, though the world would come to know her only as Mrs. Colonel Sanders. She met Harlan Sanders in the 1930s when she was working as a waitress at the Sanders Cafe in Corbin. The circumstances were complicated. Sanders was still married to Josephine, his first wife and mother of his 3 children. But that marriage had grown cold. 39 years of constant moves and financial struggles had taken their toll. Josephine had emotionally withdrawn. The partnership had crumbled under the weight of too many failures. Claudia was different. She was warm, supportive, willing to believe in a man the world kept dismissing. An affair began, one that would eventually end Sanders' first marriage. In 1947, after 39 years together, Harlan and Josephine divorced. 2 years later, in 1949, Harlan and Claudia were married in Corbin. Whatever the circumstances of their beginning, Claudia became the partner Sanders needed. She believed in him when the world called him a foolish old man. She slept beside him in the back of cars during those desperate early franchise years. And when they bought Blackwood Hall in 1959, Claudia transformed from traveling companion into the operational heart of the empire. The warehouse behind the mansion became her domain. Every morning at 6 she was there, measuring, mixing, packaging. The 11 herbs and spices that made Kentucky Fried Chicken famous passed through her hands first. She knew the blend by touch. She could tell if the ratio was off by the way it felt between her fingers. This was not cookbook knowledge. This was muscle memory earned through years of repetition. When franchisees called with questions, Claudia answered. When suppliers delivered ingredients, Claudia inspected them. When orders needed to be shipped overnight, Claudia stayed late to pack them. She was not paid a salary. She was not given a title. She was simply there, day after day, maintaining the precision the empire demanded. But Claudia's work went beyond the warehouse. She managed Blackwood Hall itself. When franchisees arrived for training, Claudia fed them. She prepared meals in the mansion's kitchen, often cooking for a dozen people at once. She made sure guest rooms were ready. She played hostess while simultaneously running a spice blending operation. Her days began at 6 and often did not end until 9 at night. 15 hours, sometimes more during busy seasons. And she did this for over 30 years. When Sanders grew furious about corporate quality cuts, when he called the new product slop, when he sued the company bearing his name, Claudia stood beside him. In 1968, they converted the warehouse building behind Blackwood Hall into a restaurant. They called it the Colonel's Lady, serving authentic Kentucky cuisine made the way Sanders believed it should be made. The corporate owners of KFC were not pleased. When Sanders planned to franchise it as a competitor, lawsuits followed. Threats were exchanged. Eventually, a settlement was reached. Sanders received $1 million, roughly $8 million in today's money. The restaurant was renamed Claudia Sanders Dinner House, removing any direct reference to the Colonel. It was Sanders' gift to the woman who had given him everything, her monument, her legacy. By the time Sanders died in 1980, Claudia was 74 years old. Her hands showed the toll. Her back showed the toll. The years of standing in that warehouse, of carrying boxes, of maintaining standards most people never saw, had left their mark. But she did not stop. After Sanders' death, Claudia could have walked away. She could have sold everything and retired. The empire was worth millions. She had earned rest. Instead, she kept working. She continued to oversee operations. She continued to manage the Claudia Sanders Dinner House. She continued to protect the legacy, not because she had to, but because she understood something fundamental. The white suit was performance. The mansion was symbol. But the work, the real work, the work that made any of it matter, was hers. The fortress had two foundations, white columns above and Claudia's hands below. Claudia Sanders worked until she could not work anymore. She died in 1996 at the age of 90, having spent over 6 decades ensuring that standards mattered more than profit, that quality mattered more than efficiency, that the promise on every bucket was kept. The warehouse still stands behind Blackwood Hall. The original mixing tables are still there. The scales Claudia used still sit on the shelves. And if you know where to look, if you pay attention to the details most people miss, you can still see the wear patterns on the floorboards. The places where she stood, day after day, year after year. The invisible machine left its mark, after all. It's not in the places people usually look. But Sanders understood the physical toll better than most people realized. Throughout Blackwood Hall, he had made modifications. Small changes that revealed how deeply he knew what his standards cost. And in those changes, in the craftsmanship and technical ingenuity most visitors never noticed, the truth of the fortress became clear. By the 1970s, Harlan Sanders had become one of the most recognized faces on Earth. His image appeared on every KFC bucket, from Louisville to London to Tokyo. He had become a living logo, a human brand. But at Blackwood Hall, he was simply Harlan, a man who still loved to cook, who still believed that the right amount of pressure and the right blend of spices could transform an ordinary meal into something magical. The mansion reflected his personality. Comfortable but not extravagant, well-appointed but not showy. But if you knew where to look, if you paid attention to the details most visitors missed, you could see something else entirely. You could see accommodations for pain. The library ceiling at Blackwood Hall was carved from ebony imported from Switzerland. Sanders had hired Swiss woodworkers specifically for the task, craftsmen who understood how to work with wood that dense, that unforgiving. It was beautiful. It was also unnecessary. Unless you understood that every detail in that house was about control, about standards, about refusing to accept anything less than perfection, even in rooms most people would never see. But there was another detail, one that revealed something softer beneath the perfectionism. The staircases. By the late 1960s, Claudia had developed arthritis. Years of standing in the warehouse, of carrying boxes, of maintaining those impossible standards had taken their toll on her body. Climbing the mansion's steep staircases became painful, each step a reminder of what those 15-hour days had cost. Sanders could not make the arthritis disappear. He could not undo the damage. But he could change the stairs. He invented what he called riser steps, staircases with unusually low rises and deep treads, designed specifically to reduce the strain on Claudia's knees and ankles. It was not a commercial product. It was not something he patented or promoted. It was simply a modification for the woman who had powered his empire from behind the walls. The fortress was not just columns and control. It was also this: stairs built for swollen joints, ceilings carved by Swiss craftsmen, details that said, "I see what this costs, and I will build around it." The mansion held both truths: the obsession with perfection, and the accommodation for the price of that perfection. But even these accommodations could not stop time. As the 1970s turned into 1980, as Sanders' health began to fail, the fortress would face its final test, not from highways or corporations, but from the one force no amount of control could defeat. Even as his health began to fail in the late 1970s, Sanders refused to slow down. He continued traveling over 200,000 miles each year, visiting KFC restaurants, making public appearances, and spreading the gospel of his fried chicken to anyone who would listen. The white suit became slightly rumpled. The famous goatee grew thinner. But the fire in his eyes never dimmed. In June of 1980, doctors delivered the news that would mark the beginning of the end. Harlan Sanders had acute leukemia. The diagnosis was devastating, but not entirely surprising. He was nearly 90 years old and had pushed his body relentlessly for decades. The cancer had come to collect what time had not yet taken. Sanders spent the summer and fall of 1980 in and out of hospitals, fighting the disease with the same stubborn determination that had defined his entire life. Between treatments, he continued making appearances, shaking hands, posing for photographs. He refused to let the illness define his final months. If he was going to die, he would die as the Colonel, not as a patient. In early November, he was admitted to Jewish Hospital in Louisville for what would be his final stay. Pneumonia had set in, complicating the leukemia and weakening his already fragile body. Claudia remained by his side, just as she had been for more than 30 years. The children and grandchildren gathered, knowing the end was near. On December 16, 1980, at the age of 90, Colonel Harlan David Sanders passed away. The boy who had learned to cook out of necessity. The man who had failed at more jobs than most people ever attempt. The entrepreneur who had built a global empire from a pressure cooker and a dream. Gone. The news spread across Kentucky like wildfire. Within hours, flags across the state dropped to half-staff. Governor John Y. Brown, Jr., the same man who had purchased Kentucky Fried Chicken from Sanders 16 years earlier, ordered the colonel's body to lie in state at the Kentucky State Capitol Rotunda in Frankfort. It was an honor typically reserved for governors, senators, and fallen soldiers. But Harlan Sanders had become something more than a businessman. He had become a symbol of Kentucky itself. The next 3 days became a statewide tribute to a man who had risen from poverty to change the face of American dining. On December 17th, mourners gathered at the Hall-Taylor Funeral Home in Shelbyville. The colonel lay in an open casket, dressed in his iconic white suit, white shirt, and black string tie. His walking cane was tucked under his right arm, just as it had been in life. Claudia led the procession of mourners, followed by their daughters, and 19 grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Most who filed past the casket were locals. Neighbors who had watched the colonel build his empire from the mansion down the road. They came to pay respects not to a celebrity, but to a friend. On December 19th, Sanders' body was moved to KFC headquarters in Louisville, where it lay in state for another day. Over 1,000 employees and admirers passed through to say goodbye. The funeral service was held on December 20th at the Alumni Memorial Chapel of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. More than 1,200 people crowded into the chapel, while others stood outside in the bitter December cold. At Sanders' personal request, entertainer Pat Boone sang, "He Touched Me," a gospel hymn that spoke to the Colonel's deep faith. The pastor read passages about resurrection and eternal life. After the service, a procession of cars wound through Louisville to Cave Hill Cemetery. Sanders was laid to rest beneath a monument featuring 4 columns and a bronze bust created by his daughter Margaret. He was buried in his white suit and black string tie, looking in death exactly as he had looked in life. The Colonel was gone. But at Blackwood Hall, the work did not stop. Claudia returned to the mansion alone. The house that had once bustled with franchisees and training sessions now echoed with silence. But she was not a woman to wallow in grief. She had work to do. After the funeral, Claudia Sanders returned to Blackwood Hall alone. The house that had once bustled with franchisees and journalists now echoed with silence. The kitchen where Harlan had taught his secrets stood empty. The bedroom they had shared for more than 25 years held only memories. But Claudia was not a woman to wallow in grief. She had work to do. The Claudia Sanders Dinner House continued to operate, serving the same Southern comfort food that had made her husband famous. She threw herself into the restaurant, overseeing operations, greeting guests, and ensuring that the quality never slipped. It was her way of keeping Harlan alive, of honoring the legacy they had built together. For 4 more years, Claudia remained at Blackwood Hall, maintaining the home and the restaurant with the same dedication she had shown throughout her marriage. But by 1984, she was ready to step back. The mansion held too many memories, the restaurant required energy she no longer possessed, and there were people she trusted to carry on the work. Thomas and Cherry Settle had been close friends and employees of the Sanders family for years. They understood the business. They respected the legacy. They shared Claudia's commitment to quality. When she offered to sell them Blackwood Hall and the Claudia Sanders Dinner House, they accepted immediately. The transaction was more than a business deal. It was a passing of the torch. Claudia trusted the Settles to protect what she and Harlan had created, to maintain the standards that had made the restaurant famous, and to preserve the memory of the Colonel for generations to come. She moved to a quieter residence in Shelbyville, where she lived until her death on December 31st, 1996, at the age of 94. She was buried beside Harlan at Cave Hill Cemetery, her name inscribed on his monument. Together in death as they had been in life. Under Thomas and Cherry Settle's ownership, the Claudia Sanders Dinner House thrived. They kept the menu virtually unchanged: fried chicken, country ham, fried green tomatoes, the legendary yeast rolls that had drawn customers for decades. The creamed spinach remained a favorite. The pies continued to satisfy sweet tooths from across the region. The restaurant's reputation grew. Food lovers traveled from Louisville, Lexington, and beyond to experience authentic Kentucky cooking in a setting touched by history. Tour buses made regular stops, their passengers eager to dine in the shadow of the Colonel's legacy. The Settles welcomed them all, maintaining the warm hospitality that had always defined the establishment. Inside Blackwood Hall, time seemed to stand still. The Settles left much of the house as Claudia had left it, preserving the artifacts and memorabilia that told the story of Harlan Sanders' remarkable life. The original stove where he had trained franchisees remained in the kitchen. Photographs and certificates lined the walls. Personal items, from his Bible to his money clip to his wristwatch, stayed exactly where they had always been. The house became a kind of informal museum, a shrine to a man whose face still appeared on millions of chicken buckets around the world. Visitors who came for the food often asked about the house. Could they see inside? Could they touch the stove where the Colonel had cooked? The Settles accommodated when they could. understanding that people craved a connection to the legend. For nearly 40 years, this arrangement continued. The fortress required new guardians, and the Settles proved worthy of the trust. As the years passed, the Settles made an astonishing discovery. Blackwood Hall was not just a home, it was a treasure chest. Tucked away in closets, hidden in drawers, and stored in boxes throughout the mansion were artifacts that had never been cataloged, never been displayed, and in some cases never been seen by anyone outside the family. The Colonel and Claudia had been collectors without really trying, accumulating the detritus of a remarkable life and simply leaving it wherever it landed. There was a letter from President Richard Nixon wishing the Colonel a happy birthday. There was the original Kentucky Colonel certificate, the document that had given Harlan Sanders his famous title back in 1935. There was the first pressure cooker he had used to perfect his chicken recipe, the very device that had revolutionized fast food preparation. The discoveries kept coming. The Settles found the original KFC flag that had once flown in front of the Shelbyville headquarters. They found one of the first Kentucky Fried Chicken buckets, a primitive ancestor of the containers now used billions of times each year. They found signed guest books from Blackwood Hall's glory days, filled with the names of franchisees, celebrities, and ordinary visitors who had made the pilgrimage to the Colonel's home. But perhaps the most intriguing find was a reel of film, 20 minutes and 18 seconds long. Dated 1965. The label read simply, Promotion Kentucky Style. No one knew what it contained. No one had watched it in decades. The film remained sealed, waiting for someone to unlock its secrets. These artifacts were not just souvenirs. They were pieces of American history, tangible connections to a story that had shaped the way the world eats. They were the evidence that the fortress was real, that a man had stood in those rooms and refused to accept defeat, that a woman had mixed spices in that warehouse until her hands swelled, that the white suit was not just marketing, but armor worn by someone who had learned what happens when you trust the world to protect what you build. Every certificate on the wall, every pressure cooker in the closet, every signed guest book. Proof. And they would all eventually be offered to whoever was brave enough to take on the Colonel's legacy. But first, the fortress would have to survive one more test. On a spring night in 1999, disaster struck. A fire broke out in the Claudia Sanders dinner house, spreading quickly through the building that had once served as KFC's warehouse and headquarters. Flames consumed the dining room, the kitchen, and decades of accumulated memories. By the time firefighters brought the blaze under control, the original structure was gone. But the Settles refused to let the fire end the story. They rebuilt the restaurant on the same property, constructing a new building that could seat even more guests than before. The new Claudia Sanders dinner house rose from the ashes, a phoenix carrying forward the legacy of the original. The menu remained unchanged. The recipes, safely preserved, continued to guide the kitchen. The spirit of Southern hospitality that Harlan and Claudia had cultivated survived the flames. Within months, the restaurant was serving customers again, as if the fire had never happened. Blackwood Hall itself escaped the fire unscathed. The mansion stood apart from the restaurant, protected by distance and fortune. The artifacts inside remained safe, the memories preserved. Whatever else might change, the Colonel's home would endure. The fortress had survived another attack, not from highways or corporations, but from fire itself. And still it stood. But as the 21st century progressed, the world that had created Harlan Sanders was long gone. The gas stations and roadside diners of the 1930s had given way to interstate highways and fast food chains. The Settles, now elderly themselves, faced a decision. After nearly 40 years, it was time to pass the torch once more. In the summer of 2022, news broke that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The Colonel Sanders estate, Blackwood Hall, and the Claudia Sanders dinner house were going up for sale. The Settles, now elderly themselves, had decided it was time to pass the torch once more. They had protected the legacy for nearly 40 years, maintaining the restaurant and preserving the mansion through fires and economic downturns and changing tastes. But the work of stewardship is exhausting, and they were ready for someone else to carry the burden. The listing was extraordinary. Buyers would acquire not just the 5,000-square-foot mansion and the 25,000-square-foot restaurant. They would also receive the trademark and likeness rights to the Claudia Sanders name. They would inherit all of the memorabilia that had been discovered over the decades, from Nixon's birthday letter to the original Kentucky Colonel certificate to that mysterious reel of film. And they would receive the recipes. Not the famous 11 herbs and spices of Kentucky Fried Chicken, which belonged to KFC and its corporate parent, but the recipes for everything else the Claudia Sanders dinner house served. The yeast rolls and the creamed spinach and the fried green tomatoes that had made the restaurant a destination for half a century. These recipes, handwritten by Claudia herself, were included in the sale. The asking price was $9 million. Interested buyers had to demonstrate at least $5 million in liquid assets just to begin the conversation. Priority would be given to those committed to preserving the legacy, keeping the long-term employees, and continuing the traditions that Harland and Claudia had established. Phone calls poured in from around the world. The Colonel's fame had spread far beyond Kentucky, far beyond America. Inquiries came from Japan, where KFC had become a Christmas tradition. They came from Canada, where Sanders had maintained his franchise rights until the end. They came from Malaysia, from Europe, from everywhere the Colonel's face had appeared on a bucket of chicken. The listing agents were overwhelmed. They had known that Harland Sanders was a global icon, but they had not fully grasped the depth of devotion his memory still commanded. People were not just interested in buying a restaurant. They were not just investing in real estate. They were not acquiring a business opportunity. They wanted to own a piece of history, to become the custodians of a legend, to inherit the fortress that a man had built when the world kept taking everything away. Because that is what Blackwood Hall had always been. Not a mansion, not a headquarters, not even a home, really. A fortress. Built by someone who learned that the only thing you can truly control is what you build with your own hands, on your own land, according to your own standards. The Greek revival columns were declarations of permanence. The spice warehouse was a refusal to trust others with quality. The riser steps were accommodations for the price of perfection. The artifacts in the walls were proof that it had all been real. And now, someone else would have to decide what to do with that fortress. Whether to preserve it, exploit it, transform it, or let it crumble. The listing was not just a real estate transaction. It was a test. Would the next owner understand what they were inheriting? Would they see past the buckets and the branding to the psychological architecture underneath? Would they honor Claudia's 15-hour days and the Swiss craftsman who carved ebony ceilings and the man who invented stairs for swollen joints? Or would they see only dollar signs and photo opportunities and the chance to own a famous address? The fortress was for sale, and the world was watching to see who would be worthy of its walls. But while the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. Today, right now, the Claudia Sanders dinner house still operates in Shelbyville, Kentucky, and Blackwood Hall still stands beside it, its white facade gleaming against the Kentucky hills. The fortress endures, at least for now. Today, the Claudia Sanders dinner house still operates in Shelbyville, Kentucky. It serves the same menu it has served for more than 50 years, prepared according to recipes that predate the fast food revolution. Customers still order fried chicken and country ham and those legendary yeast rolls. They still finish their meals with pie, just as diners did when the Colonel himself walked the dining room floor. Blackwood Hall still stands beside the restaurant, its white facade gleaming against the Kentucky hills, exactly as it did when Harlan and Claudia first saw it in 1959. The original stove remains in the kitchen. The memorabilia lines the walls. The spirit of the Colonel seems to linger in every room. A presence that cannot quite be explained but cannot be denied. The mansion has become more than just a house. It has become a symbol of what is possible when determination meets opportunity, when failure becomes fuel for success, when an old man with a pressure cooker and a dream refuses to accept defeat. Visitors who make the pilgrimage to Shelbyville often stand in the parking lot for a moment before entering the restaurant. They look at the mansion. They imagine the Colonel standing on that porch, watching the sun set over his Kentucky home. They try to connect the global brand they know, the face on billions of buckets, with the humble reality of this quiet property on the outskirts of a small town. The connection is not always easy to make. Kentucky Fried Chicken has become KFC, a streamlined brand optimized for the modern age. The company that Harlan Sanders built has changed hands multiple times, passing from investors to corporations to multinational conglomerates. The chicken itself has evolved, adapting to new tastes and new markets and new demands. But here in Shelbyville, something original survives. The Claudia Sanders Dinner House serves chicken made the way the Colonel believed it should be made, without corporate shortcuts or efficiency experts or focus groups. It is the only restaurant outside of KFC authorized to serve his original recipe, a living link to the source of the phenomenon. And Blackwood Hall stands watch, just as it has for more than 60 years. The mansion that became a headquarters, that witnessed the birth of an empire, that sheltered the Colonel in his final years. It refuses to surrender to time. But what does a house mean when the people who built it are gone? What remains when the laughter fades and the arguments end and the kitchen grows cold? For Blackwood Hall, the answer lies not in architecture or real estate value. It lies in the story the walls contain. Every room in that mansion whispers of a journey that should have been impossible. A boy loses his father at 5 and learns to cook out of necessity. A man fails at job after job, never finding his place in the world. An entrepreneur watches his successful restaurant destroyed by a highway and faces ruin at 65. And then, impossibly, triumph emerges from the wreckage. The mansion is proof that the story was real. It is tangible evidence that Harlan Sanders existed, that he lived and worked and dreamed in this specific place. When visitors touch the original stove, they are touching the same metal the Colonel touched. When they walk the halls, they are walking where he walked. The connection across time is physical, undeniable. This is why people care about old houses. This is why preservation matters. Buildings are not just shelter. They are containers for memory, vessels that carry the past into the present. Blackwood Hall carries the memory of a man who refused to quit, who turned disaster into opportunity, who proved that success has no age limit. But it also carries something else. The memory of Swiss craftsmen carving ebony ceilings. The memory of Claudia standing in a warehouse for 15 hours, measuring spices until her hands swelled. The memory of stairs built specifically for swollen joints. The memory of every franchisee who learned in that kitchen. Every artifact hidden in those walls. The fortress was never just about Sanders. It was about everyone who powered it, everyone who built it, everyone who understood that perfection requires human hands, not corporate efficiency. That is the meaning of Blackwood Hall. Not just one man's triumph, but a monument to what happens when people refuse to compromise, when they choose quality over profit, when they build something that requires them to invent special stairs just to keep going. The Greek revival columns were declarations. Spice Warehouse was resistance. The riser steps were love made tangible. And the artifacts in the walls were proof that it all mattered. That is what remains, That is what survives. Not just a mansion, but evidence that human beings can build fortresses against a world that constantly tries to tear down what they create. Harlan Sanders died more than 4 decades ago, but his legacy shows no signs of fading, and the fortress he built continues to ask a question of everyone who sees it. What will you refuse to surrender? KFC now operates more than 27,000 restaurants in over 145 countries. The Colonel's face appears on signs and buckets and advertisements, in languages he never learned, in places he never visited. His image has become one of the most recognized symbols on Earth, rivaling Mickey Mouse and the Golden Arches for global awareness. But the true legacy is not measured in restaurants or revenue. It is measured in the lives he touched, the opportunities he created, the example he set. Harlan Sanders showed the world that it is never too late to start over. He proved that failure is not final, that setbacks are just setups for comebacks, that persistence in belief can overcome any obstacle. His story has inspired millions of entrepreneurs, particularly those who feel they have missed their chance. When a 50-year-old wonders if it is too late to pursue a dream, the Colonel's example provides an answer. When a 60-year-old faces financial ruin and despair, the Colonel's journey offers hope. When anyone anywhere feels that the best years are behind them, the Colonel's life stands as a reminder that the best may still be ahead. At Blackwood Hall, that legacy takes physical form. The mansion is more than just a historic property. It is a monument to perseverance, a temple of second chances, a reminder that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. It is proof that one person, with enough determination, can build something the world cannot take away, even when highways are built, even when corporations buy you out, even when fire destroys the restaurant. The fortress endures, because it was never really about the building. It was about what the building represented. Control in a world of chaos, standards in an age of efficiency, quality when everyone else chose profit. That is the legacy. Not 27,000 restaurants, but the stubborn, impossible belief that it matters how you do things, even if no one is watching. Especially if no one is watching. Before he died, Harlan Sanders left one final message, not in a will or a speech, but in a request that revealed everything about the man behind the white suit. He asked that mourners express their sympathy not through flowers, but through contributions to charity. He had given away millions during his lifetime, funding children's hospitals and scholarships and causes he believed in. He wanted his death to continue that tradition of generosity. It was a fitting final request from a man who had known both poverty and wealth, who understood that money means nothing unless it serves a purpose. The Colonel had spent the first half of his life struggling to survive. He spent the second half building something larger than himself, and he wanted his departure from this world to leave it a little better than he found it. That same spirit lives on at Blackwood Hall. The mansion and the restaurant beside it are not just businesses. They are living tributes to a philosophy of hard work, quality, and genuine care for others. The employees who serve customers at the Claudia Sanders dinner house are carrying forward a tradition that stretches back nearly a century. The guests who enjoy the food are participating in a ritual that connects them to the Colonel himself. And somewhere in those quiet rooms, among the memorabilia and the memories, the spirit of Harlan Sanders seems to linger still. Not as a ghost, but as an idea, as proof that one person with enough determination can change the world. The fortress was never about keeping the world out. It was about protecting something worth keeping. Standards, quality, the belief that how you do something matters as much as what you do. And that belief, that stubborn refusal to compromise, is what truly survives. Not in corporate boardrooms, not in 27,000 restaurants, not in the streamlined efficiency of modern KFC, But here, in Shelbyville, where the yeast rolls are still made by hand, where the recipes are still written in Claudia's handwriting, where the stairs were built for swollen joints, where the fortress still stands. As evening falls over Shelbyville, the lights of the Claudia Sanders dinner house glow warmly against the darkening sky, and across the parking lot Blackwood Hall waits, silent, watching, remembering. Inside the restaurant, families gather around tables laden with fried chicken and country ham. Conversations blend with the clink of silverware and soft background music. Laughter rises and falls like the Kentucky hills themselves. Across the parking lot, Blackwood Hall stands silent. The windows are dark, the porch is empty, but the house does not feel abandoned. It feels like it is waiting for someone to understand what it represents, waiting for someone to carry the story forward, waiting as the Colonel himself waited during those desperate franchise years for the right moment to begin again. The mansion has witnessed nearly 2 centuries of history. From the aftermath of the Civil War through the Great Depression, the fast food revolution, and into the digital age, it has sheltered families and entrepreneurs and legends. It has seen triumph and tragedy, success and failure, life and death. And still it stands. Still it waits. Still it holds the memory of a man in a white suit who refused to accept that his story was over. That is the legacy of Blackwood Hall. That is the meaning of Colonel Sanders' Shelbyville estate. Not just bricks and mortar and antique stoves, not just Greek Revival columns and ebony ceilings, not just artifacts and memorabilia and mysterious reels of film, but hope, perseverance, the unshakable belief that it is never, ever too late, the belief that you can lose everything at 65 and still build an empire, that you can watch highways destroy what you built and still start again, that you can be betrayed by corporations and still maintain your standards, that you can build a fortress, not with moats and battlements, but with spices measured by hand, with stairs designed for swollen joints, with Swiss craftsmen carving ceilings no one will ever see, with 15-hour days in a warehouse, with handwritten recipes, with the stubborn refusal to call bad chicken good enough. The Colonel knew it. Claudia knew it. Settles understood it. And now, perhaps, so do we. The fortress at Shelbyville stands as proof. Proof that determination matters, that quality matters, that how you do something matters just as much as what you do. Proof that one person, with nothing but a pressure cooker and a dream, can change the world. Proof that it is never too late to build something worth protecting. The white suit was theater. The mansion was symbol. But the fortress? The fortress was real. And it endures.